Welcome to today's social system mapping deep dive session for March 21st, 2020. Your hosts today, as usual, are me, Christine Capra, and Kara Martiner, who is our producer and my partner in all kinds of crimes. So what this is, for those of you who are new to this, thinking there's a couple who might not feel like they're totally clear about what we're doing together. I just want to help get you grounded so you can decide if this is how you want to spend your next hour and a half. So first, this is about a vision. It's about a vision and a possibility. So there's this kind of mapping that we refer frequently to called social system mapping that you'll hear us talk about a lot. And we believe, those of us in this community practice believe that this kind of mapping can help communities and change networks become more self-organizing more quickly and wisely, and can catalyze greater potential in all kinds of collective learning initiatives. So at the highest level, this is about leaning into that possibility and turning our vision into a reality. It's also an opportunity to learn about this kind of mapping, as well as to get familiar with and literate in the body of theory that supports our belief in the potential, that informs our mapping practice, and that is an essential ingredient of our map reading process. It's an opportunity to contribute your own experience and expertise to this emerging mapping practice, because it's not just about theory, it's also about lived experience and insight into the dynamics of people working together, which I know if you're here, you all have experience in and thoughts about and expertise that the rest of us don't have. So it's a community of practice and field building with an intent for all of us, regardless of our role in this community, to become carriers of a culture of generative transformation. So whether we're mapping, whether we're contributing to the field, no matter what we're doing, we are wanting to do it in a way that helps us become more transformational in how we show up, and that we do that together and it ripples out. So like I've alluded to, not everyone in the community is a mapper, but we're all engaged in learning about it, knowing where it's useful, contributing to the field, whether we're actually literally making maps or not. So for this particular session, we have community practice sessions just about every Monday of the month. And this is the third Monday, which means this is our deep dive session. And it's not so much an introductory session, although if you haven't been introduced to social system mapping, you're welcome to stay. But the third Monday of the month is what we have a deep dive, where we sort of dig deeper into a topic that's relevant to social system mapping. And today we're going to talk about visualizing. I'm not sure if we're exactly visualizing our social system mapping theory of change or the adaptive action cycle with social system mapping, but we've got this has sort of been a shared exploration that has different angles into it, and we're going to share a couple versions of it with you today, and then that have been emerging around those themes. And then we're going to hear from you about what they bring up for you, what resonates, what doesn't resonate, how they, just how they strike you. So that's that. Today's facilitator is going to be Jim Best. He's the one of the graphic visualizers trying to help in this exploration. And we have a guest who's also going to share some stuff, which is Sara Raffo, and we didn't get her in the slide deck, but you'll get to meet her in a little bit. So for our agenda today, it's really open and loose. We don't have we're not hardcore about it. This is our welcomes. And we'll start with we'll do some introductions in the chat in a moment. Jim will share a model. Sara Raffo will share her sketches, which are work in progress, or the very beginnings of a work in progress. And then we're just going to open it up and hear from people and see how it's all landing. And so I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to invite you to, if you want to, in the chat, give us your name, pronoun, location, a network that you're working with, or community that you're that somehow is prompting your interest in this topic? And Stacia, welcome. If you'd like to do a quick mic check, feel free to unmute for a moment and say hi.
Hi, everyone. Thank you.
Welcome. Stacia has, for those of you who have met Aldo Damore or have worked with Aldo or read the blog post we did together, Stacia has worked with Aldo in the past in Africa, the cool map of his. Welcome, Cecilia, who is now in the UK. Afternoon there, right? Yeah. And Sara Raffo has been meeting with a handful of us for a while, but this is her first time joining us in a community of practice session. So this is exciting. And Melissa's also in the UK, Cecilia. Okay, Ben, Jim, we have a handful of the usual suspects as well. So I'm going to go ahead, and the next question, I have a question for you to put in the chat, is just for us to take a moment and to think about what do you feel like the visual medium gives us that words or data on their own don't give us? So how does the visual medium, whether it's pictures or cause and effect maps, any kind of visuals, how do those impact our thinking differently than data, just data by itself or words by themselves? Yeah,
it's an open question.
Yeah, in the
Everyone.
chat.
Okay.
Yeah, but if you want to say for a moment, I mean, we could have a moment to verbalize as well. I think we're open in our timing. Yes. Melissa, I think that's that differential in our cognition is like hard to articulate in words, but it is a different way into our brain that I think is more complete and informative. So let's go ahead. I'm going to just hand it over to you, Jim. And unless I'm feeling a strong need to intervene in some way, I'm just going to let you take it from there and introduce Sara when you're ready. And is that okay?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay. And I'll shut up.
So yeah, let me share my slides here. I got about 5 slides. It's about 5 minutes to lay this out, and then I'd love to get, have input around that, and then I'd love for Sara to show her, walk through her articulation of this as she heard us. So sorry, I'm really still waking up evidently. Okay, you see my screen? All right. So
Yes.
what we're talking about is, the thing we've been talking about is Christina said the adaptive action cycle is this center, the engine of the work we do in doing systems change. And we've got social system map and as a thing, and social system mapping as a process that rides on that, but adds this extra huge added value. So so walking through that, Christine uses Glenda Young's depiction of a complex adaptive system and a depiction of an adaptive action cycle. And just to review that, and we're talking about complex adaptive social systems. So we're talking about people and people's activities, not so much things and places and activities per se, but or events. Well, it could be, but we're talking mostly about people-focused stuff. So we're talking about those behaviors, those activities that people do together, and they naturally create larger patterns in the complex adaptive system, in the community. We're talking about communities of people being together here. That's the complex adaptive system focus here. So those patterns are strong. They create social norming that constrain the behaviors. And you get this reinforcing loop between the behaviors that happen and the patterns that emerge. And so sometimes those are patterns that you actually don't want in your community, either individually or as a collective. So if you're going to do system change, a way of doing that system change is by observing those patterns and those behaviors, and really just looking at what's going on there, noticing that using all your senses to do that, whether there's stories or conversations or collecting data, surveys, whatever. You look at those patterns and then you ask, so what? What do we make of that? Try to make some sense out of those patterns. You're kind of developing a theory of maybe of change, but mostly just a theory about what's going on. What did you see there, right? And then if you're going to make a shift, you're switching to now what? Planning some kind of intervention, some kind of change that will influence either the patterns or the behaviors here, but hopefully the behaviors here, which then emerge in pattern differences there. But you really don't know how that's going to work out because it's a complex adaptive system. It's uncertain. So you do lots of these little experiments of like, oh, I saw that. This is what we think this means. Okay, well, what if we change this? And so you do a little poke at the system and then you see what happened to the patterns in another cycle of what, so what, now what, another adaptive action cycle. And if you have lots and lots of these small experiments, you start to feel your way forward as you see the effects they have on the patterns and see if it's moving towards the direction that you have intention around. So that's the adaptive action cycle. It's really all about the learning that happens in this. And it's about there's a what, so what, now what, and then there's do. You actually have to act. So that's the basis of that. And Glenda says, we do this all the time. We don't have this diagram in our mind. We just do this all the time. Anytime that we want to change anything, whether it's a habit around the house or our health or a system or our community or our place of work or wherever, we're constantly testing, poking, changing, observing what happens. So this is a very natural process. All right, so given that sort of engine that may hopefully work on a complex adaptive system, we add in the people here. So here's these little clusters of people which are part of this system. I'm pulling them out so we can see them in action. They're constantly learning from these cycles of adaptive action, either individually or in small clusters or as an entire collective, right? Oops. And they're learning through actual action. And that action comes in so many different forms. Sometimes it's just conversations that we have with people. Sometimes it's initiating or activities. It's all sorts of self-organized activities. It's making connections between people. It's providing resources into a community. It's moving resources. Sometimes we, codify this as network weaving activities, where a group of people sit back in a community and intentionally do connections, movements, self-organization, initiating stuff. But we're all doing it simultaneously, whether you call it network weaving or whether people are individually just excited about things, but we're acting and we're doing this cycle here. So the big added value is that you only can sense what you can sense through, the means that you have at your disposal in doing these cycles, until you abstract out a social system map, which gives you the ability to see things you couldn't see in any other way, especially relationships, relationship patterns, relationship structures. You also get to see beyond your personal network horizon. You get down on the dance floor and you see what you see on the dance floor, just the people that you're interacting with. But you get up on the balcony, this is definitely an up on the balcony kind of view here. And you start to see patterns there that you couldn't see otherwise. So you're seeing beyond your personal network horizon to a much wider breadth of people. And, there's a cognitive load that you can usually assume, which is, dozens and dozens or 100 people or so that are in your personal network horizon. And all of a sudden here, you can see to hundreds or thousands of people, not with that same resolution that you do in your personal network, but in a different way, and you can start to see patterns there. So this is adding a whole new realm of sensing into this what, so what, now what cycle. So not only are you seeing and looking at the system itself, but you're seeing this reflection of it. And so finally, the other thing that you get to do here is you get to model the social system mapping scope. You get to change this tool where you're looking at different parts of the system. You get to modify it. You get to go and say, that's not an important thing to look at. Let's look at this. Let's ask different questions about people and the human assets they bring. Let's ask different questions about the social capital or the relationships that people have. And you can dig into that, not just looking at patterns, but you can ask for stories, and the stories show up in the map as well. So not only have you got this whole thing going on here, but as you're thinking about the now what's and saying what would provoke a system change here that might change here, you're also going like, are we looking at the right stuff? And you can modify that. So that's it. And I'll leave this up and you can make that small if you want. But the questions that come up for me, so I needed this. I needed some way of thinking about all the pieces that Christine and others have been pulling together. I needed one place to put them in, and maybe other people don't need that. But the idea of having a single static diagram that shows up in things that we publish, or being able to talk about it, has been important to me to sort of pull all the pieces together. So one of the questions I have is, are these all the pieces? Are these all the pieces that are important about thinking how social system maps and the process of social system mapping affects system change, how we use it? There may be all sorts of other ways to think about this and other ways we use it that aren't in this diagram. So what are those? What are we missing? Or what's misconstrued? Or where is the emphasis in the wrong place? Or are there other places that would be equally productive or more productive? And I think that's the place to hold it. I see Ben's got a hand up on this, and I'm going to stop sharing. All right, or should I stop sharing?
Actually, can you keep it up for a second? I think my
Okay, yeah.
comment will make more sense if we can look at this.
Please.
So one of the things I'm discovering in my use of social system mapping is how much of the value is very much at the fine-grained level, at the interpersonal level or the small group level. So it actually fits with the picture of the people underneath the picture of the map. That the maps are super useful at that scale. They're not just about abstraction. They're not just about sensing the patterns in the whole. And this diagram kind of, to me, is saying that's what the map is for. You know, and if you're operating at that more personal and small group level, you know, that's something else. We use other tools, but I would say the map is every bit as powerful in that domain, even as a communications tool, as part of working through this entire cycle through the map potentially.
Yeah, I want to pick that apart, but maybe I would like to come back to that. Other comments?
This is Mary. Yeah, I really appreciate this, and so grateful for what you have done here. And where I sort of go with it is sort of fitting it in with the iceberg model of and thinking about those parts, which this is part of that, and it goes in. It really adds something very practical to that. So that's what I'm thinking about.
So being able to articulate more of the inner workings,
Yes.
gives some window on the iceberg, on the stuff that's less visible underneath.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, and do you mean being able to articulate it, or do you, like Jim is doing here, or do you also, or it mean the map itself?
I was
Like
talking.
mapping.
I was talking about this, and obviously I have more thinking to do in terms of the iceberg, but it brings a more interactive picture to the iceberg, and offers more, and maybe the iceberg may add something to this picture. I don't think I need to say much more, but I like to look at this and the iceberg together, or that's where I am. So I don't have too much more to offer other than wanting to look at both of those at the same time.
Mhm.
And you're thinking about what we do in this process of social system mapping. Are there things that we're missing, or just from this diagram? Just, it's the thing I'm most worried about, is like, oh, this, you know, this is, anytime you make something concrete and specific and simple, you start losing richness. Ben called out the richness that happens at the small group level. That's not articulated here very well at all. you know,
Maybe it's just me, but I think, and it's going to do the concrete idea, that we're still not at the level of where change is being made in the world, to my mind. I mean, this is a very abstract, can fit any shoe, all one size fits all, and each different, like California doing in economics or nutrition or healthcare or helping homeless, are each going to have their own particular, and this doesn't extend out to that quite. I mean, I know it's there, but it's always going to have to see the flow of how this works, I think might be interesting.
say that last sentence again.
To see the flow of how the complex, here's the other thing. A lot of our systems are detrimental and being kept up because of the way they've been structured over colonialism and everything else we're fighting against. And those have forces working against what we're trying to do here. And seeing those and thinking about how they affect this might be also helpful.
So let me see if I got this. I think the scope of this is focused on the community and on what happens inside. And you're talking about, there's all these other systemic forces outside that are holding this community in place, and they're not even on this map.
Right. Because the problem is so many of our efforts go into not actually doing transformational changes, but just oscillate with the system, going up and down and never really going over and passing the tipping points that we need.
So the other thing it makes me think is, you know, June Holly often talks about intentional networks, right? So we get together not to be together, that's our relational network, but to do something in the world, that we have an intention together. You know, we want to eliminate racism. So we all get together for that. And yes, there's this whole community dynamic of relationships that allow us to build an action network based on our relational network. We have an intentional network, we have a support network, and we have an action network. And this diagram, I think, is more focused on the relational network and is not really thinking about our intention and the work that we do in the world necessarily. Nor is it taking into account the impacts, as you were saying. So if you've got systemic racism and or extractive kinds of thinking that constrain this community, it's a bubble where you're trying to change the culture to be generative, loving, and it's existing within this extractive racial capitalist world. Yeah, none of that stuff is showing up here, I don't think. Thank you. If you would put other thoughts that come up in the chat as we go, that would be great. But I think we should shift to Sarah's picture of the world, which, Sarah, I invite you to talk about how you came up with what you came up with. And yeah, I'm super excited to see the threads of where this is going. We were talking about what does a visual image give you that doesn't from data. We'll check out where Sarah takes us. Should I stop? I'll stop sharing here. And is that an okay segue to you, Sarah?
That's great. Thank you so much, Jim. I'm so excited to be here with all of you. I'm relatively new to this area. And it's been wonderful to feel so welcomed and to feel excited about the possibilities in this community. So my name is Sara Raffo. I am a graphic designer. I'm also a teacher. I teach college students at California College of the Arts. And I started meeting with Christine, Brian, and Mary at the beginning of this year. And we usually graphic designers meet with people with like very specific goals in mind. They're coming in, they're going to make something. Maybe they even know what the thing is they're going to make, like it's going to be a brochure. And we instead started our process just very open. You're probably not surprised by this, but we just had conversations every 2 weeks. And some of the things we did at the beginning were I mapped the students in my class, and then I had the students continue to sort of evolve that map as we spent more time together. I used adaptive action a little bit in feedback sessions in my class. And so I've been sort of trying to understand some of the big ideas through using them with my students. And at the beginning of March, in one of our conversations, we decided that we had something a little bit more specific to talk about, which was the wonderful diagram that Jim just shared, as well as some visualization that Christine was working on. And so we had about an hour-long conversation where we went through some ideas, and I took a lot of notes. One thing that's particularly exciting for me in that conversation is usually as a graphic designer, I take in the words and then I make images. But what was really exciting was Christine and Jim were making diagrams that were in conversation with each other, and they were sort of evolving them and going back and forth. So that was fun to see. And what I decided coming out of that conversation was to take Jim and Christine's words and then just kind of think of which images came to mind, or sort of what might visualize that conversation. And so I created this kind of sketch that I'm going to share with you today. I find that when I'm sketching, the form is very loose. So the lines look a little bit more scribbly versus more defined shapes. I often find it's also helpful to sketch with motion, to sort of see what happens if things move as part of the process. And this isn't really sort of finalized graphic design. It's just an exploration that we thought it would be fun to share with you all today. So I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to read along and show you what are sort of slides that are a reflection of that conversation. Okay, so folks in this conversation said that complex adaptive systems include big patterns and elements we surface, identify, discover using containers and differences and exchanges. Interactions of agents create patterns. These hold the system in place and make it resistant to change. Adaptation is happening, but it will be in the same pattern. It is reactive change. We can be more aware and intentional about this change. Pattern logic is any set of tools, methods, or models that allows us to step outside our own mental model. Here we are zoomed out. We could also zoom in. Social systems mapping is a particular model or method. It is a special way of visualizing. It is an orientation, but we can't take action from it. It allows us to ask, what does it mean? What does it suggest we might do? A map allows us to engage in the adaptive action cycle. A map is shareable. We can make adjustments collectively. We are co-creators. The adaptive action cycle is the engine driving this change. Changes to our community change our map. the map is constantly evolving. Our community is constantly evolving. So at the end of that process of visualizing the conversation, one of the questions I had is, does it make sense for this to be pulled out as separate pieces, or do the pieces come together at the end as one big diagram where everything is related? And so that's the end of the visual I have to share. And I'm curious about the question that Christine started with about what this brings up for people, or any responses people have.
Thanks so much, Sarah. So especially folks that are new to this collection of people, beginner's mind is just like a treasure. So please lead us.
I would also want to play around with it a little bit more. I feel like I could take the first diagram and the story and piece them together to explain to people what it is I love about mapping. It's always really hard to explain. Aldo has given me some things, and watching him try and explain it, we were a good team. With my fresh brain and understanding of Malawi, and his understanding of what all of you do, and you guys have gone so deep sometimes I get lost, but that made it very simple. And it was beautiful. It was like I was at a poetry reading. I was a little lost in your words. Yeah, I don't know how you might want to share it, but I might copy something like that at some point and chew on it a little bit more. Thanks for sharing.
I liked seeing the movement so much, even though we know we're always working with an evolving picture, we're always looking at static images, and sometimes we get stuck there, or we just need to see more movement in how we're representing things, I think.
Yeah, thank you. What came up for me was the narrative. And for me, what we need to shift cultures, not just patterns. And narrative and storytelling strike me as the way to do that. And what we're engaged in here is a very relational, it's connective tissue building between people. And I wonder sometimes, if I live in a very knowledge economy, I like to see things from a systems point of view. Are we ourselves caught up in our own paradigm of seeking constantly to understand systems and missing some of the fundamentals, like love, for example? Are we being too mechanistic in the way that we see and visualize these things? And are we aware of our own assumptions and biases in the way that in a Northern European culture from which I come, we like to map things? But it was a really lovely visualization. I too was mesmerized by it. So thank you very much.
So why not map love? Mercedes, you want to speak? Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Ben. So when I was listening to Jim and looking at the graphic, I had a lot of questions coming. My organization, the California Partnership to End Domestic Violence, defined the problem as one of the many interconnected forms of systemic oppression. So I couldn't but go back immediately to our theory of change. And when I think about the what, and so what, now what, so all these questions, how can I identify in a map the power dynamics? What are the questions that I need to ask? What do I need to know? What I don't know that I could know, but looking, observing, and identifying from the map, I have the opportunity to be on the floor and also looking for the balcony. So what I don't know that I need to know. And, you know, I'm sorry, I have more questions than things to offer right now, but all these things come right. I have been working in a little map of 60 organizations, and I am wondering what are the questions that I need to have? How do I articulate the things that would allow me to see what I need to know, what needs to change, knowing that for sure is the culture that needs to change in the work I am doing in the field I am. So one of the stances of our work, or my work, is keeping one foot anchored in domestic violence while pivoting towards other social justice movements. So how can I reflect that in the question that I want to ask? Yeah.
I really like what you have just shared. We're looking at proposed questions for our community of practice map, and it has opened up just a lot of thinking around that. So I think that would be a good area for us to explore as a community. I'll just stop there.
One of the things that's coming up for me is the relationship between patterns at the micro interpersonal level and the relationship of those patterns at the interpersonal level to the relationships at the broader systemic level. And I feel like there's this tension that's often I'm sensing in our community of practice between focusing on, like Ben, when you said, map the love, and which is kind of the point, and being able to step back and see the patterns of how the love is flowing tells us a whole lot. If the love is flowing from like to like, all the people who are the same are loving each other, and there's no love flowing across the differences or resources or whatever the significant differences, which it depends on the context, what are the significant differences. But from my perspective, the other piece that I was thinking about was what's missing from these graphs is the purpose. Like, why would we, what's the point of shifting these patterns, or what's the point of developing these relationships? there's some broader purpose. And so kind of at the end, Sarah, of the thing you were talking about, I'm just talking totally, I'm not, these are partial sentences, partial thoughts, not, they're just what's bubbling up. But at the end of your thing, Sarah, I was thinking, oh, we're like this connecting. So we have this moving community, this moving system. We need to connect that back to different large scale patterns, systemic large scale patterns. So we actually probably should be looking from the small scale patterns and how they impact, like the starting point, and then coming back to the starting point again with different large scale patterns. And that's, to me, the purpose of social system mapping, is to actually change the ways the systems are structured so that we're not just reinforcing, because we can use this and just reinforce the same power structure. And we can use maps. I mean, Melissa, what you said about mapping in general, maps to me are powerful, and they're tools of power. And mostly that power has been used to oppress and dominate and extract and exploit for, millennia, or as long as there's been maps. For the most part, that's what maps do. And so if we're not actually calling, social system mapping was designed, the tools were designed to undermine that, to enable everybody to be part of it, to enable it to shift, not for any abstract, not for just random reasons, but actually to shift systems. That was the point that for which I developed sumApp, and have sort of the whole field of social system mapping has emerged from that. And so I'm just thinking the whole thing could be value neutral. You could just see the whole thing as a value neutral, maybe a better way of a better social networking platform. But social networking platforms, as we've noticed, are very dangerous. And leaving out the purpose, like I was sitting there feeling like, yeah, the purpose isn't here, and I should be purpose neutral as a software developer, but I'm not at all. I'm not value neutral. So I was just sort of thinking about that, like that tension between the focus on the developing relationships at the interpersonal level and the value there versus, and that tension between large scale pattern shifting and how they fit together, because we're often looking at it as if it's one or the other, and I get accused of leaving the personal relationships out all the time, which is not at all my intent. But so I'm just thinking about the relationship between the two, and the graphic relationship between the two, and the overall purpose of being transformational, and not just more piling on of power within the existing power clusters. I'll shut up.
Cecilia, you haven't spoken. Do you have something you're holding there?
Yeah, I mean, in my first time here, I think, yeah, about the first map, the one that you showed, Jim, I was just kind of, some of the arrows for me actually make sense in the opposite direction. Like you put, for example, the network, and that the network that is kind of our artificial way of making sense of that, makes sense of the complex system. So actually that relationship for me was kind of, I'm still trying to understand why. I know that is a working process, but just to reflect about that was interesting for me. And then, yeah, because for me, that representation is, at the end of the day, is one moment in our sense-making process. And that is hard for me how that makes sense. Probably is kind of suggesting that the system self-organize and makes sense of that picture, that graphical representation that was created. So I think in terms of the first presentation, that was kind of one of the key reflections that I still have. Yeah, about the Sara presentation, yeah, I agree. It was kind of very mesmerizing. And I think especially one of the limitation of the graphics in general, I think, is that they are statics, and we are trying all the time to convey this message that the systems are dynamic and self-organized. And I think just to have that metaphor in the way that Sara presented was very, I think it's a good starting point. I teach, or I try to teach system thinking to undergraduate students, and it's kind of a hard way to deal with them. So probably, yeah, I think to just use that very kind of example in self-organization for us, I think it's something easy to understand, but for them, I mean, it's very complicated. So I think that concept for me was the key part of reflecting today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ben's got his hand up.
Yeah. Well, you just said something about static versus active perspectives, I think, Cecilia, and it brought me back also to the suggestion, Sara, in your presentation that the mapping isn't about implementation, it's not about doing, and I think I heard that as a hypothesis or a suggestion, which reminds me, my work has been in dialogue and convening for a dozen years now, and there's this paradigm of talk versus action, right? And the complaint that something's all talk and no action. And the first process that I fell in love with was the World Cafe methodology, and in the book that lays that out, they have this diagram, which contrasts this traditional view of we talk and then that leads to action, and these are different things in a linear flow, with what they called then an emerging view. This was in 2000, I think, of conversation as a core process. And I wonder what would happen if we put mapping in here, or thought of mapping, at least part of what mapping can do, as a kind of conversation, especially social system mapping, where lots and lots of people are all signaling things. And this is maybe an expansion of the adaptive action cycle in some sense, with a few more steps in here, because it's adding the reflection and exploration into collective insights, et cetera. But the idea is all through this process, we're talking. and potentially all through this process, we could also be mapping and viewing mapping as a kind of asynchronous conversation space in a way.
I think now that, that you mentioned, Ben, the asynchronous part, I did research with healthcare, and in healthcare, no one can be at the same time at the same place, and how difficult is that. But I use with them maps, kind of, I call them outcome-based map, more as a provocation, in order to them, something that this is kind of one working process. What do you think? So they were able to rearrange kind of the pieces on the map, and then someone else look that new proposal and kind of also make a comment and put feedbacks and move things around. So I think that can be kind of an example of asynchronous participation, and the map was more like a provocation, something that can raise concerns, or I don't know, just open the conversation.
Raise concerns, but I'm also thinking, people can signal commitment in a map, and isn't that a kind of action, or offer resources, and probably many other things that we might call action.
I'm just going to comment, just a tactical comment. I forgot to mention at the beginning of the hour that our general format is that the formal as this has been, goes to the top of the hour. And then we usually have an extra half hour where we just, a handful of us stick around. I for sure will. I don't know if Jim is planning to or not, but okay. So we just, at the top of the hour, we just have a little goodbye ritual for people to go on with their day. And then we hang out for an extra half hour. So if you want to hang out and talk some more, I forgot to mention that at the beginning. And since we're getting close to the top of the hour, I thought I would just comment on that now. And if we've got one more brief comment, let's do that. And then let's have our goodbye ritual and then see what remains. If anyone has a Mercedes, you're going to head off?
Yes, so we
Okay.
have a meeting. Thank you so much.
Okay, let's do the, hold on one second. Let's do the goodbye ritual right now then, which is everybody unmute. I'm going to count 3, 2, 1 in just a second. And then we'll all say, send off with blessings and release and bless you for the day. So 3, 2, 1. Have a wonderful day.
Have a
wonderful
wonderful day.
Thank you for showing
Thank you
up.
for joining.
Yes,
Thank you.
thank you. Now we have Reiner wanting to join us, and I'm going to let him because he's familiar with our thing, but just usually I think it's probably better not to have people jumping in at the end. Hey, Reiner, welcome. You missed the first hour. Yeah, and it's muted. So we're in our informal half hour after half hour. So if you want to stick around, cool. But you missed the major content. So
That weird period when Europe hasn't changed their clocks and we have. So
yeah, daylight savings time. Yep, messed you up.
Fingers crossed. Hopefully, no more soon.
Yes, yes. But well, cool. We've got a bunch of people sticking around. What else is bubbling up or coming up for people?
You know, I'm actually interested, Stacia, with the time that you've spent with Aldo and having all of those images and ways of being that are different but related to this. Are there things coming up, more things coming up for you that from that perspective?
Yeah, I mean, when I can answer that question is when I'm explaining a map to someone else, and it reminds me. And I love that discussion point that you just put up with the circles and circles and circles. And every person I describe a map to teaches me something about describing a map. I just don't think there's ever one way you can do it because it connects differently with each person I talk with. So I'll let you know. I'm doing a little session next week with our city group, and I'm working with a bunch of people where the language is different. I'm a dietitian, so I've gotten into this through nutrition, which is very diverse because I need a clean environment and water, and I need education, and there's all sorts of gender things, and there's just so many pieces to helping us have good nutrition. So for mapping, it helps me personally because I just see through the muck. Sometimes I look at my map and I get lost and frustrated, and other days I look at it and I go, oh, I could do this. Yeah, so I use it personally, and then I do my best to, I do a lot of screenshots and a lot of, as we're having a meeting, I'll pull from the map and I'll do a little drawing. I might do something like Sara next time and put it in I do a lot of videos these days, put on Zoom and quickly show people. I'm playing around with the Google Docs right now. Anyways, yeah, little by little we say. But at the beginning, I felt like there was a bunch of muck in the system. I also have calls like this, Aldo and Jeff and I from Kumu, trying to simplify things for our environment in Malawi. We just need simple, and I'm sorry, but we can't pay anything here either. So we're always looking for freebies. And with the dollar pricing, it's massive for us. So yeah, different context to bring to the table too, and get you guys thinking of Africa a little bit from an American voice.
You know, if I can comment on Melissa's comment about different worldviews, the sort of a Western reductive view, which mapping tends to fit in certain ways, even as we're trying to serve, you know, the building of a culture that's regenerative, love-based, abundance, rather than extractive. I struggle with this all the time. And the thing that you just said, Stacia, about seeing through the muck, that's just such a great value of maps and other kinds of tools that are reductive in a sense. When you're trying to see this complex system that's a mesh, you know, you get through the muck by abstracting some of it out. And at the same time, I think of Milani Goodchild's paper on the two wampum belt of the Dutch and the Potawatomi, I think, coming to a treaty by, you know, the Potawatomi built this belt that was a symbol of the treaty, or the understanding, which was to have a flow of the settler colonialists and a flow of the indigenous people running parallel, mutually responsive, mutually respectful, with connections between them. And she brings it to the thinking that we've got indigenous wisdom and we've got this Western paradigm, and they need to run parallel to each other and be learning from each other with these connections between them. And that's our way forward. And there's something here about that in my mind that, you know, as Melissa was talking about, what if we really looked at this really differently, you know, rather than so mechanistically? And I think, you know, the intention of a culture change that Christine talks about, of moving and being aware that maps are potentially very extractive, but somehow holding them simultaneously. You know, holding the relationships, using the maps to build the relationships, which are loving and supportive and culturally, you know, cultivating. Sorry, there's an end to that. I'm complete.
One of the things that came up for me when I was listening to this is that in the real world, whether we're creating a connection or we're breaking connection or even maintaining connection, that requires energy. And a lot of times systems thinking ignores that, or, you know, kind of doesn't pay attention to that fact. But the energy has to come from somewhere, and it has to sometimes be channeled or intentional. So I think that's also something that needs to be thought about.
Well, and especially if we think about energy as a finite thing, and especially like energy as human attention and human time, it's intensely finite.
Yeah.
And so how do we deal with that?
Yeah, right.
We're all limited.
Yeah, and I think entropy, you know, even though it's a physics term, Jeffrey West talks about social entropy, that, you know, we have to fight against that, because that's also the tendency of the system to go to entropy, I believe.
Yeah.
I think the point about our attention as a limited and scarce resource is interesting in the context of mapping. You know, so often we're afraid of extracting that precious time from people. Mm-hmm. And I'm also seeing how mapping can be a very efficient way for a group of people to signal things to each other, especially if they're highly, you know, if they're distributed geographically. So you're never going to get everyone together at the same time on the same call, or we're just all so busy that even if it isn't a matter of time zones, it's just hard to have, you know, again, all that asynchronous mode to do everything. So just a simple way to send little bits of information for everybody in a system. That's what social system mapping supports, among other things. And it can be very efficient, I think, if a group learns to use it that way.
Well, and I think it can help us be very efficient in, I mean, often when we're setting out to build connections and we're doing a convening around creating more, you know, creating deeper relationships, et cetera, we're doing it in a very random way. And I get that there's, you know, a systemic value in randomness and just seeing what happens. And if we have more information, we can start to do it in ways that our systems shifting in terms of helping, you know, like helping deepen conversations across differences, the significant differences that entrench power structures the way they're entrenched, or just finding the most, you know, the most generative connections quickly and easy, rather than, you know, just in a random way that, you know, you have to like meet 100 people in this network and then you find the 2 that totally change your world, you know, like if you could narrow that down to, oh, I think there's 10 people who have that potential given what they're into, and I could reach out to all 10 of them, and then I could quickly find the 2 that are hugely impactful. That I just think we don't have a real way of doing that when we're building relationships, and social system mapping can give us enough insight to begin to be more focused in that development. There was another thing I was thinking about, that Melissa, back to your point about maps and their use and the abstractness, because, you know, I fell in love with dialogue before I fell in love with mapping, and data management, data gathering was simply a way I made a living, and it wasn't, data visualization was exciting. But anyway, my point is that I wasn't planning on doing this, what I do. It wasn't something that I had a dream of, and I would have been much more a relational, you know, I'm much more into the actual touchy-feely intimacy universe than the abstract universe. But so I'm often in tension about this work that I do. And one of the ways I think about it is that there's a difference between, I mean, there are cultural differences between people who are into the love and the relationship and the dialogue, and then the very abstract thinking system, which I consider the masculine, reductionist, scientific universe that that generally is in power, has defined our worldviews, and that we need to be, you know, like be liberated from those worldviews. And so one of the things that makes me feel better is to think, well, maybe this could be a bridge, or maybe it's like, if you think of the 3 horizons, maybe this is the second horizon thing that helps what I call, no offense to the men present, you know, it helps the doodly dudes, like the guys, you know, I won't use my bad terms, but, you know, like the abstract hyper masculine who think that they're systems thinkers and think that they're being transformational and think that they are, you know, trying to save the world, but in fact are so deeply embedded in their own worldview that they don't even know how to do that at an intimate level, at a close level. And I think of this as like, well, we can ooch along this thing, because they do get, like, a lot of white men are into this. We do get attention, and then if we hammer on the transformational pieces, maybe we can help shift that, because those people do, it doesn't need to be shifted. And I know I'm sounding a little dehumanizing and insulting, and I don't mean to, but I think of it as a potential to help move from that more abstract perspective to that more connective perspective, simply because of how it is we're building and what we're building and what we're focusing on. And the provocation that Cecilia mentioned of being able to look at and think about the structures that we're seeing. So.
I just want to make a quick note about the graphics. I realized, so the graphic that I put up there was like animated. It was like 4 pictures. And then there was all this hand waving and talking and pointing and stuff about the graphic. So the graphic doesn't just sit by itself. Neither does Glenda's original stuff. And neither does Christine's. This has been the graphic that I was working on is a conversation with Christine about basically the graphics that she's been using and talking about in hand waving. And then you add Sara's, which has got all this beautiful motion in it, and it's like 3 minutes or whatever. but it too is much richer than a static graphic. And that's what evokes for me all this excitement about, oh, I'm seeing things because of the movement that she's put into her graphics. So I don't know that there is a single picture that we can have anywhere here, but yeah, I just wanted to note that these are not standalone graphics in any way.
I just want to throw in, Stacia, what you said about there isn't, like, you don't have a way of describing it, like there isn't one way. And I often feel like that is a reductionist perspective. And like there's this been, for years, it's been this pressure on me to describe it well and to get better at and to show what it's about. And I often just feel like it's complex. There's a lot of complexity. It depends on, a bazillion things. It depends on the context and the people and the, where you are. I mean, it's that the description of what we're trying to do. So I have really appreciated, Jim, your effort to make a one-pager, because it has pushed my thinking really in ways that I have resisted for years. And I have resisted because I feel like just that desire for one simple answer is dumbing down and is reductionist and goes against the grain for me personally. I'm not much of a reductionist dumbing down kind of person, in case you haven't noticed. But the tension between and the exploration of the two has been very generative. And I don't think it's entirely possible. Or it is. Two really abstract thinker types like Glenda and Brian and other people. But then they know how to read in context and situation and scope and intention and all that stuff. Or hopefully they know how to do that.
I really appreciate, Christine and Jim, your process of how you were in conversation with your graphics and continuing learning. That has been so inspiring to me. And Sara, I don't know if you have any comments about graphics and learning and as more process related reflections. I don't mean to put you on the spot.
It's okay. There's just so much in this conversation. I'm taking a lot of notes. Yes. And I think that it's just so interesting to think about how a diagram or a map, often in a graphic design context, can feel like the end point to a process, like the finish, the thing that we're all trying to get to, and then it just exists. And what I'm hearing a lot in this conversation is the relationships that people have with graphics they have created or brought together from various sources that are not, they're never meant to be an endpoint, but they're a way to, like, they are a living thing that they are using to do something. And it's just interesting from a graphic perspective to hear, I think, especially from Cecilia and Stacia, about how I think Jim has also been putting in the notes that like a map could be a provocation, a map could be like a map as a different type of thing. And I'm really appreciating the relationships that people in this group have with graphics as a means of doing their work rather than an end to a process.
Yeah, Reiner.
The words of Sara made me think like a painter who has done one picture of a, let's see, a mountain range and a sea, a lake, not a sea, a lake. And if he comes there again 5 days later, I don't think he will be painting the same picture again. So, and our connections as well between lots of people in this situation, how they relate to each other, are changing as well. So therefore, I appreciate what Sara has said about this, that there can't be an endpoint and the thing frozen and without life then. So let's just end.
Well, with all that said, I get a lot of thank yous from my groups for doing what I do, so I keep doing it. They get a lot of little aha moments, even though they can't figure out what I do or why or how. They fill in the forms and I give it back to them all the time. So somehow we're valuable, I think.
Even if we can't explain what we're doing.
I think you come close though, Christine. You know, it just struck me the generative, that it's a gateway to a conversation often, and it's a generative conversation. And in conversation, we change through encounter. So I really hear also that it's only ever a snapshot in time, but it can be updated. But that dynamism, those complex adaptive systems, that kind of feedback loop, the way that nature is dynamic all the time is very hard to reproduce. But we're working with the best tools we've got, I guess. And so thank you, Christine, for that generative element, that gateway to a conversation feels to me a really important aspect of what we can do.
The graphic that Ben shared earlier is great because it feels to me like you could easily plunk a social system map at the core of that. And, so there's a map maybe in the, not that it's the central thing, but then around it is the conversation. And then around it is the collective insights, harvesting discoveries, action. So it is a tool for generating conversations and reflection and action planning and implementation if we use it as fully as we could, which I think we're still learning how to do. But
yeah, just one point I'd like just remembered is I've really, reflecting on who the we've used we a lot. Who's the we and who has access. Yeah. This information, and Mercedes was saying earlier, we never map power and privilege, and that's one of the challenges, that those dynamics at play. And so, who is the we in these processes? Yeah.
Well, and to me, that's been a huge thing lately, is who is the we, and doing our best to make sure that the we is anyone in the community who is impacted by the map and wants to have impact, wants to help form the conversation. And how do we do that in a way that doesn't, that excludes dominance, but is inclusive, is a process. I mean, the map itself isn't gonna solve that problem. How we map, how we approach mapping, how we think about mapping, and how we update our maps and how we define our questions is where that would come in. And it strikes me that that's a valuable practice to learn, not just how do we have an equitable conversation, but how do we have equitable processes that require sort of nitty-gritty, boring, icky things like wordsmithing and changing a survey, that kind of stuff how do we do that in an inclusive way that doesn't get bogged down with requiring consensus? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a bit of a crux issue there. Network weaving is done by a small group of people who are up on the balcony and thinking about this, and they've got the time and energy, and maybe they've got a role, maybe they're paid in an organization. Certain people gravitate, or certain people have privilege to be in that position. They have the time. And so power moves to them inadvertently. So as you were saying, Christine, having conversational modes, social norms where turn taking is super important, where people are building the map together. But immediately when you can say people building the map together, and that's the intent, that's the structure of your tool. But certain, only 10% of the people are actually going to have the opportunity and initiative to be that engaged. So you're constantly fighting that dynamic.
Yep. Ben's hand is raised.
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously the digital divide and time, those are some barriers, but at the same time, the tool itself is incredibly inclusive once you pass that, right? There's no hierarchy, and everybody's got the same surveys, right? Everyone's filling in the same data and has the same invitations. So I think it's very inclusive in that way. I'm just gonna say this like it's the third time for the hell of it, because it feels like it's important to me that maps to me are not just a provocation for a conversation or a way to engage. They are a form of conversation if we use them dynamically. And I just think it's not how we normally think about it, because it's this very delicate thing that's stretched out in time, which is little bits of signals and statements that we can do. But I'm using a map right now to help a group of about 35 people self-organize around a set of topics, and they're saying, or activities, and they're saying, here's an activity I'm interested in, and they're pointing to that to somebody else's and saying, I'm committed to doing that with you, or I'd like a conversation with you, or here's a resource. And to me, that's a form of dialogue. It's a form of real powerful communication that means, and so the map isn't static at all that way. It's not like we take a picture and then we talk about the picture and analyze the picture, and then we take another picture, get more data. That's one view of it, but this tool can do more than that. And that's what where most of my energy is flowing with it now.
Love that image. It's in a continuum of tools and ways of having conversation that aren't face-to-face verbal, but asynchronous, but also moving into email and Slack and other tools in which we're communicating. The map provides this very different way of signaling and conversing.
That's inclusive in a lot of respects.
Just before we jump off, I want to just say thank you so much for having this rich conversation. This is really helpful, and in my mind puts the whole idea of trying to create a diagram in question. Like, yeah, maybe you should give up. Maybe it really is just a conversation that goes and goes.
But Jim, it was a really good conversation. That's kind of where I started. It was like, oh, why does he want to do? Okay, fine. I'll go ahead. I'll play the game with him.
Thank you.
But it did. I mean, that's the thing. Visualization can give us insight into each other's thinking that we can't get in any other way. And it was really valuable. Yeah. I just want to say how much I appreciate just the new voices, Stacia and Cecilia. It was great to hear from you and hear how you're processing and thinking about this. And I would invite you back and to just share and come and hang out with us whenever you want. It's good fun to have you.
Look at that, Melissa. You're an old voice now.
Yep, I just relegated you to the old voice category. And Sarah's a new voice, not to me, but to this context. Yes, and a voice and a new visual as well. Yeah.
And thank you, Reiner, for jumping in, and you brought some really great images. Thank you.
Okay, I've got to go. Bye, everyone.
Okay. Thanks,
Thanks
everyone.
for your time
Have
and
a
Thank you so
expertise.
much.
day. Bye.
Bye-bye.